네, 동아시아 최고의 지성과의 인터뷰 프로그램 여러분들이 사랑하시고 더 이상은 여러분들을 별로 사랑하지는 않는 듯한 점점 기고만장해지고 있는 글로벌머니토크입니다. 저는 이 프로고요. 저의 오른쪽에는 중앙일보의 기둥, 중앙일보의 얼굴, 삼프로TV 글로벌머니토크의 엄마 강남규 선임기자님이 나와 계십니다. 어서 오세요.
예, 강남규입니다.
엄마 안녕.
Hello, son.
네. 글로벌머니토크를 강남규 기자님이 낳으셨기 때문에
오케이.
예. 오늘은 저희가 하이테크 지정학이라는 걸 배웁니다. 예습을 좀 안 해오셨겠지만 저는 예습을 해왔거든요. 100년 전에 예를 들면 반도체 회사를 어디에 세워야 돼? 라고 하면 뭐 원료 조달이 쉽고 무역이 편하고 뭐 이런 그냥 인건비 좀 괜찮고 싸고 뭐 설비 투자 잘할 만한 그런 나라에다 세웠겠죠, 당연히. 그러나 지금은 반도체 회사를 어디에 세워야 돼? 라고 하면 고려해야 될 게 너무 많습니다. 우리 편이 맞냐, 뭐
그렇지.
대신할 가능성이 없냐 등등 그런 걸 이제 따져야 되는 그게 바로 하이테크 지정학이라는 건데요. 또 여기에 전 세계 권위자 한 분이 있지 않습니까?
예. 사실은 그 하이테크 지정학을 개척했다라고 하는데 국내에서는 잘 알려지지 않아서
네.
사실 제가 좀 국내의 이분을 소개하고 이른바 이제 발굴하는 의미에서 인터뷰를
네.
했습니다. 굉장히 젊고요. 캐나다 출신입니다. 아비슈르 프라캐시. 여러분들 구글링을 해보면 어떻게 나오냐면은 지오폴리틱스 퓨처리스트, 지정학적인 미래학자라고 얘기를 합니다.
이분이 최근에 세계는 수직적이다. The world is vertical.
예. 세계는
책.
평평하다고 하는 그 미국의 저널리스트가 쓴 책이 있죠. 토마스 프리드먼이 쓴 책.
그 책은 아주 유명한 책이고.
예, 그 책을 사실은 살짝 비판하면서
패러디?
부정하고 그 다음에 제목을 반대로 평평하다를 수직이다.
세계는 수직적이다라는
예.
책을 쓴 분인데요.
예.
인터뷰를 하면서 그 책을 사실상 그냥 읽어본 것 같은 그런 느낌도
그렇죠.
있게,
예.
예. 인터뷰를 그럼 시작해 보겠습니다.
인터뷰에 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 어떻게 그 한국 독자들과의 대화는 처음이실 듯한데 이 하이테크 지정학 이걸 언제부터 관심을 갖기 시작하셨나요?
In 2013, I started this journey, and I realized that when people were talking about geopolitics, they were talking more about oil or natural gas or currency, as we hear about today with what's happening in Europe. But I was seeing something very different. I was seeing, well, what is the future of geopolitics? And I believed, and I still believe, that the future of geopolitics is technology. And so my goal with these books, it's quite strange. I don't consider myself an author the way others do. My goal was really to connect the dots and share them so people had an awareness that this is coming. And as other guests may have shared with you, when you write a book, after you end up publishing it, you don't actually want to see the book anymore because you read the book 8, 9, 10, 12 times, edited it, and then you just publish it, and then everybody wants to hear about the book and you're tired of it. So I've done that 5 times now.
하이테크 지정학이라고 이름을 붙이셨는데 지정학이라고 하면 그 부분에 대해서는 좀 익숙합니다만 일반적인 지정학과 하이테크 지정학이 혹시 차이가 있다면 어떤 지점에서 좀 다른가요?
This design of geopolitics, where it's all being about either resources or geography, like land, or finance, like currency. This has been the circle of geopolitics since World War II. This has been how geopolitics has functioned since World War II. Now, what I've been saying since 2013 is that a new circle is emerging, what I call next geopolitics. That the old circle is not going away, it's not disappearing, but a new circle is emerging where things like artificial intelligence or robotics or virtual reality or the metaverse, gene editing, space colonization, these are going to become the new drivers of geopolitics. And so as a geopolitical futurist, if you imagine that as a hat that I wear. My focus really is on how are these technologies going to transform geopolitics? And then, as a co-founder of my advisory company, what does that mean for my clients? Whether they're a government, whether they're a business, whether they're an institution, a rapidly growing startup, whoever they are. Because one of the big differences between the old world of geopolitics and next geopolitics is that the old world of geopolitics only affected a handful of people, investment banks, defense companies, really big governments. Next geopolitics affects everybody, not just big economies, not just big multinationals, everybody. One example is in June or July 2020, there was a fight between India and China in the Himalayas. There was a skirmish. And to retaliate against China, India banned TikTok. So TikTok is banned in India right now, along with many other Chinese apps. Now, when India banned TikTok, all of the focus was on what will happen to TikTok's revenue, because India was its second biggest market after America. But something else happened. Thousands of Gen Z and millennials in India lost their income because they were using TikTok to upload videos and make money. So all of a sudden, people that were 15 or 18 or 25 who may never have cared about geopolitics, right? They're more focused on uploading these videos. They cared. Their livelihood had been changed. So that's one of the key differences.
그동안의 지정학이 뭐 에너지, 금융, 그다음에 또 뭐 다 군사력 이런 변수를 중심으로 해서 이루어진
지정학이 그런 것에 미치는 영향을
그렇죠.
공부했는데
그걸 중심으로 이루어지는 국가 간의 갈등, 그다음에 지역 내 세력 판도 이런 거였는데
이제는 지정학이 하이테크,
인공지능, AI, 로봇공학, 그다음에 메타버스, 기타 등등 여러 가지 그 IT 기술과 관련된 그 기술을 중심으로 벌어지는 국가 간의 갈등, 경쟁, 패권 다툼 이런 거라고 얘기를 합니다. 그런데 세계는 수직적이다. 이 책 제목 자체가 그 너무 익숙합니다. 사실 그 세계는 평평하다. 세계화에 대한 어떤 그 지지 내지는 옹호 이걸 중심으로 한 책이었습니다. 그 세계는 평평하다를 좀 벤치마킹하면서 그 이름을 좀 따서 책을 좀 팔아보실 생각으로 그런 제목을 나신 것 같은 느낌을 지울 수가 없습니다. 어떤가요?
Tom Friedman's book, I don't compare the two books. The World is Flat was really, because I read it, it was not really about globalization. It was more about outsourcing. That was really the focus of his book as to how jobs could move, how people could access companies. It was really about the emerging field of outsourcing, specifically to do with American outsourcing to the world. The World is Vertical is about the new design of globalization. It's about a fundamental transformation in how the entire world functions. Now, if we think about what do we mean by globalization, let's put the World is Vertical on hold for a second. When we say globalization, what do we mean? What we really mean is that since the end of World War II, there has been a certain direction that countries have been moving in, getting rid of economic barriers, adopting the same political ideas and principles, integrating the economies, prioritizing trade that had less tariffs, so free trade, joining the same institutions, whether it's the United Nations, World Bank, World Trade Organization. I mean, the WTO right now, the World Trade Organization, has, I believe, 96% of the world economy in the group. So 96% of the global economy is part of the WTO. There is only 2 countries that are not full members of the UN. it's a real, this design of integrating the world along the same channels, along the same protocols, along the same systems. SWIFT is another example of financial integration around the world. This is what we call globalization. And on the back of this almost homogenization in how the world works, on the back of this, multinationals have flourished. On the back of this, you have the immigration, right? The ability of people to move from certain parts of the world to other parts of the world for opportunity has been because of globalization. Now, I'm not saying that globalization is bad. I want to make that clear. There has been tremendous benefit of globalization. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. But as this happened, as globalization took off, there were some serious challenges. The biggest is that a lot of countries felt that they were losing their sovereignty. They were losing their culture, their identity. They were losing what made them unique in the world. That as they opened up to the whole world, as they let the whole world in, they were losing control over their own societies. If you didn't like the way that globalization was functioning, tough luck. You ended up like North Korea. You ended up like Iran, isolated in the world. But now, in large part because of technology, now countries are walking away from the global systems. Now countries are saying, we want to hold the world at an arm's length. We want to create a different kind of integration with the world. So the way I explain the vertical world in a sentence is that instead of the world being open and accessible as it once was, now it's full of these walls and barriers, vertical, that are, and this is fragmenting everything in the world, from supply chains to immigration to every aspect of our sustainability is being now divided and fragmented and splitting.
사실 그동안 우리는 한 30년 동안 1980년 이후에 그 프라캐시 설명이 그 세계는 장벽을 열고 시장을 열고 그다음에 노동력이 자유롭게 이동하는 그 세계, 돈뿐만 아니라 돈과 자원뿐만 아니라 노동력마저도 자유롭게 이동하는 세계를 꿈꾸면서 한 세대로 왔는데,
사실상 경제로만 치면 전 세계가 한 나라.
그 한 나라죠. 그걸 이제 뭐 경제학자들은 이렇게 얘기합니다. 뭐 2차 세계화 시대. 그다음에 1차 세계화 시대는 뭐 1870년에서 한 세 동안 펼쳐졌고 1차 세계대전으로 막을 내린 그 시절이 있었습니다.
예.
그런데 이런 동질화를 추구해왔는데 이제는 정반대로 가고 있다. 그런
얘기죠.
예.
예. 세계가 평평하다고 하면 대체로는 전 세계가 하나의 나라라는 의미라면, 그거의 반대 개념인 세계가 수직적이라는 말은 전 세계가 이런저런 다양한 블록으로 쪼개진다는 뜻인 것 같기는 합니다. 대체로는 그럼 세계가 어떤 방식으로 구체적으로 어떻게 쪼개지게 될 것으로 예상하십니까? 지금은 뭐 미국과 중국 두 그룹으로 분열하는 것을 예상하는 분들도 있고, 또 그 이상의 조각을 생각하시는 분도 있을 텐데 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
In the book, I have identified 12 countries, 12 or more countries that are making decisions that are ending up with the world being more fragmented. So here are a few examples. And this is not about the future, Nam. This is about now. This vertical world is taking off right before our eyes. Now, before I get into the examples, another key point is that I published this book in October of last year. This is before the Ukraine war began. The Ukraine war has only accelerated the vertical world. So the Ukraine war, as we can kind of all see, is splitting the world. It's businesses are leaving Russia. McDonald's, Siemens, SAP, Renault, the French car maker, Toyota just announced. And what makes this so significant is that these companies have left Russia not because of sanctions, but because of their own ideological choice. They've chosen to walk away from billions of dollars in revenue. Now, I've worked with the private sector. That's unheard of. That is a new way of thinking in business. So that itself is a vertical world forming, because this is the new barrier. Ideology is now defining where businesses operate. This is a new kind of barrier, the return of ideology, if you will. But there are other examples too. So take the UK. The UK has become extremely worried about Chinese technology, extremely worried about, especially Chinese telecommunications technology. So the UK has done two things. Number one, they've launched a group called D10, which stands for 10 democracies. And they want to set the global rules for 5G. Now, this is very important. Remember what I said about the old era of globalization. Institutions like the UN represented the whole world. Right? Globalization was about integrating the whole world along the same channels. D10 only has 10 countries. So the new institutions are exclusive. It's almost like a tribal-like mentality that's emerging to govern the world. The UK doesn't want to work with everybody. We only want to work with 10 democracies to set the global rules for 5G. So now you're going to have these different blocks competing as to what rules should the world follow. So instead of there being one set of rules the world follows, Western Europe might have its own rules. East Asia might have its own rules. Latin America might have its own rules. That's one example of the UK. Another very provocative example in the UK, again to do with China, is that the UK wants to ban foreign students, specifically those from China, from studying specific technology subjects. So the UK is saying that if you want to study cybersecurity or aerospace and you're from China, we won't allow you. Now, this is, if you think about the ethos of the West, it's been about not treating people based on their ethnicity. Not, we're not going to ban you from studying a subject in school because of your ethnicity. That's many decades, if not centuries old way of thinking. But now, because of technology and this new kind of geopolitical competition, the UK is proposing this. Another example is Saudi Arabia. One of the big driving forces of the vertical world is that every country and every company is going to have to pick sides. The era where you could stay neutral is over. Everybody has to pick sides. Just like I said, those companies have left Russia. They're picking their side. So Saudi Arabia is taking this to another level. Saudi Arabia is saying that starting on January 1, 2024, if you want to work with the Saudi government, if you're a foreign company and you want to work with the Saudi government, or if you want to work with Saudi government-backed companies, organizations, you have to base your regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia. So if you want our money, you can't be based in Dubai or Doha or anywhere else. You have to be based within our borders. Now think about that. If you're a foreign multinational, you're thinking, I've never had to worry about that. I've looked at the Middle East, with the exception of Iran, with the exception of Israel. I've looked at the Middle East a certain way, right? I can access Saudi Arabia from the UAE or vice versa. Now Saudi Arabia is saying, nope, pick sides. And this is happening as Saudi Arabia rewires its economy around technology, like Neom, the megacity.
세계화 시대를 주도했던 나라들도 사실 서방입니다. 시장을 열고 국경을 열고 인간과 자원과 돈이 자유롭게 이동하는 그런 어떤 지구촌을 향해서 가야 한다고 부르짖었는데 왜 이즈음에 하이테크를 중심으로 그렇게 기술적 장벽을 블록화시키고 서로 어떤 동질성보다는 서로 이질성을 따지는 세계로 바뀌었을까요?
There are three main triggers of the vertical world. The first is, as I said, is loss of sovereignty. Now, what do I mean by loss of sovereignty? Loss of sovereignty meaning I can no longer control the direction and destiny of my economy or society. I am now dependent and reliant on other economies, on other governments for my own success. That's a big part of losing sovereignty. Sovereignty has eroded in the vertical world because in order to integrate, in order to trade, you had to get rid of barriers. You had to let other companies in. One example of a country who has been holding globalization or trying to limit globalization and who is taking even more action with technology is India. It's quite interesting. If somebody searches up Starbucks in India, just search it up on Google, you're going to see Starbucks, the logo, and underneath you're going to see a company called Tata. And you're going to wonder, why is Tata there underneath the logo of Starbucks? Because the Indian law requires foreign companies to partner with local companies if they want to open up a retail shop, when Starbucks is a retail shop. So this is an example of we want to limit how much footprint these foreign companies have. So the biggest is sovereignty. The second is that, at least in the Western world, there has been a realization that globalization isn't necessarily benefiting the Western world as much as, say, China. Our jobs have moved overseas. Our supply chains during COVID-19, all the generic materials, all the PPE was coming from China, right? The reliance on business expansion is no longer focused on Europe. It's all focused on Asia. It's all focused on Africa. And so there's been a real questions have emerged in the corporate boardrooms and in government capitals as to, is this kind of open economic design still working for us? It worked for us in the past, but not necessarily anymore. And the third, which isn't as prevalent as the first two, is about culture. It's about that countries, and it's partly linked to sovereignty, but countries are realizing that their culture is now being challenged by globalization, that their unique culture, their unique beliefs are starting to change. Again, I'm not saying whether this is good or bad. What I'm saying is that this is the status quo that's emerging. There was an article I read that in Australia, churches are in decline and other religious buildings are now being erected. And so the question Australians might have is, well, why is this happening? What is happening here? What is happening to our culture, our society? And if that is now the thinking, that we have to protect our culture, then there's only really one way to protect the culture. That's to build these barriers. So these are the three main drivers of the vertical world: sovereignty, economic competition, and culture.
자, 흥미로운 세 가지 설명을 하시는데 첫 번째는 간단하게 요지만 설명을 드린다라면은 세계화 시대에 세계화는 곧 어느 정도 개별 국가의 주권을 어느 정도 양보해야 되지 않습니까?
그렇죠. 장벽을 쌓고 싶은데 못 쌓고.
예. 그래서 자기 운명에 대한 결정을 못하는. 그리고 너무나도 이제 그러니까 사실 미국도 반도체의 싸구려 반도체 시절에 저렴한 반도체는 중국산에 의존할 수밖에 없었지 않습니까?
네.
그 메이커가 SK이다, 삼성이든 어디이든 간에. 그러다 보니까 자기 운명에 대한 결정권이 자기 손에, 각국의 리더나 국민들 손에 있지 않다는 만성. 그다음에 두 번째는 세계화가 과연 서방의 이익에 부합한가 이거 그냥 회의를 갖기 시작을 했다는 거예요.
서방도 세계화의 혜택을 입긴 입었으나 월마트 같은 데 가면 바로 느낄 수 있는데.
그렇죠. 그다음에 이제 미국의 도널드 트럼프의 영원한 홈타운이지 정치적인 홈타운 미국의 중서부 러스트 벨트 가면
그런 데 가면 일자리 잃은 피해 상황을 볼 수 있는데
그렇죠.
전체적으로는 제3세계 국가들이 더 많은 이익을 얻었다는 게 중론이죠.
네, 그렇죠.
세계화에.
그러면서 자연스럽게 각국이 가지고 있는 자기들의 문화 이 자체도 사실은 어느 순간 보면은 특히 호주 예를 드는데 프라캐시는 호주의 어느 순간 교회가 숫자가 줄어들고 이슬람이나 다른 어떤 종교 시설이 많이 늘어나는 그런 현상을 보고 거기에 대한 어떤 반감 이런 것도 작용을 했다.
뭔가 장벽을 쌓고 싶다는 생각이 다시 들었다는 거죠.
그거죠. 우리 서방이 우리 거 좀 지켜보자 그런 생각.
사실 물건만 좀 비싸게 사면 되는 건데 그것만 포기하면 우리끼리 잘 살 수 있는데 라는 생각을 하기 시작했다는 거예요.
예.
요즘은 반도체가 이 하이테크 지정학에서의 가장 뜨거운 주제가 되고 있을 것 같은데 반도체 전쟁의 의미를 지정학의 차원에서 보면 어떻게 해석할 수 있을까요?
Just let's pause the chip war for a second and let's just take the rise of China. China's rise in the world right now is now before China's development story and China's growth in the world. I'm talking about its global footprint. It was really driven by financing, loans, or infrastructure, like the Belt and Road Initiative or the massive amounts of infrastructure that China built in Africa. Now it's undergoing a second phase where China's rise to superpower status, if we want to say that, is going to be largely driven by technology. As this happens, countries around the world are realizing that the economic fuel for their economies is no longer going to rely on manufacturing. It's no longer going to rely on the old industries. It's going to rely on technology. Technology is now becoming the core of economies around the world. So as this happens, the semiconductor fight between countries is directly related to those two things. That China is rising with technology, and China is challenging all of the established norms with technology. And China's rise with technology is largely dependent on semiconductors. China can't really build anything without chips. And at the same time, other countries, including South Korea, are realizing if we want to grow our economic power in the world, we need to double down on these areas. So South Korea has unveiled a plan by 2030. They want to spend $500 billion almost on becoming the world's chip hub. Now that is an enormous objective, an enormous decision by the South Korean government, and I applaud them for taking this amazing move. But it also means that South Korea is now competing with the States, its closest ally, on semiconductors, and at a time when the U.S. wants to build a domestic chip capacity. So that itself could be a future chip war. But the chip war is leading to the vertical world in pretty unexpected ways. And South Korea is actually, the government has created a list of the people working in the technology industry, and they're monitoring where they're traveling to. So that's also an example of South Korea starting to wake up and say, hey, we care about our talent just as much as anyone else. South Korea is one of the world's technology powerhouses, and it's realizing talent is now the name of the game. Fighting for talent is the name of the game.
사실은 그 반도체가 이제 핵심적인 지정학의 하이테크 지정의 핵심 주제라고 얘기를 하면서 각국이 이 자국 내에서 조금이라도 반도체를 자체 수급에 자체 조달하기 위해서 엄청난 돈을 투자를 하고 있다. 근데 이 와중에도 그게 쉽지 않을 것이고 한국이 수천억 달러를 투입을 해서 세계의 반도체 허브가 되려고 하는 꿈, 그 부분에 대해서 상당히 긍정적으로 본다. 그런 말을 하셨습니다.
생산을 하든 소비를 하든 뭐 반도체 영역이든 다른 영역이든 우리와 다른 블럭에 있는 나라는 그냥 그 나라들은 지구에 있는 게 아니라 화성에 있는 걸로 생각하면 된다.
그렇죠.
미국 입장에서 볼 때 혹은 우리나라가 미국의 블럭에 속한다면 그 블럭의 입장에서 볼 때는 이제 중국, 러시아 뭐 이런 국가들은 지구에 없는 걸로 생각하자.
그렇죠. 그러다 보니까 그동안 사실은 많은 인재들이 IT 기술자들이 국경을 넘어서 이동할 수 있었지 않습니까?
예.
이제는 그럴 가능성이 줄어든다. AI 전문가가 대만의 AI 전문가가 더 이상 본토에 가서 고액 연봉을 받고 일하기는 쉽지 않은 세상이 됐다.
중국 본토에.
예.
그러면 그럴수록 경쟁은 치열해지고 참 먹고 살기 어려워질 텐데요. 자꾸
그렇죠.
똑똑한 분들은 밖으로 빠져나가서 또 그분들의 몸값을 받아야.
문제는 이제 그 과정에서
네.
이제 프라캐시 말로는 대만이라든지 한국이나 일본, 미국이 인재를 지키기 위한 전쟁을 벌일 것이다. 그런 얘기를 강조를 했습니다.
인재를 지키기 위한
예.
전쟁.
왜 그러냐면은 모든 IT 기술이나 첨단 기술일수록 인재가 곧 경쟁력이고 기술일 가능성이 높기 때문에 그 인재를 어떻게 자국 내에 묶어둘 것인가.
예.
그렇다면은 어떻게 세계화의 시대가 이제 막을 내렸다라고 봐야 될 것 같습니까? 어떻습니까, 프라캐시 씨?
It's actually something that I've thought about a lot. So it's a very, very important question. Let me step back for a second. There's a lot of people saying that we are entering an era of deglobalization. Deglobalization has become this buzzword. But this is not an accurate way of looking at what's happening. Deglobalization implies that globalization is ending. Globalization is not ending. Globalization is being remade. Globalization can't end. It's not that everybody is going to go into their corners and not talk with one another and work with one another. That's not possible. But the way in which we think about globalization, that's changing. So that's why the subtitle of my book is The World is Vertical, How Technology is Remaking Globalization, not leading to deglobalization. And the key message that one of the key messages is that the pendulum of globalization, if you think about globalization like a pendulum, it was swinging towards the post-World War II design, like I described, and now it's swinging in a different direction. But that doesn't mean that it won't swing back. Maybe it swings in a completely different direction, not swinging back, but goes in a different direction. But my belief is that the vertical design of globalization is here to stay for a good amount of time. That this is not a 2 to 4 year status quo. This is not even a 1 decade status quo. That we are at the beginning of truly a new era for the world. And it's not possible to put a timestamp, but it's not going to be a short period. And one of the key challenges that is going to come as a result, and we're just starting to see it, is that the tensions between countries is only going to increase. And one of the examples that I give is that we're almost going to a pre-World War I setup, where you have these blocks, geopolitical blocks, and they all want to operate behind their own curtains and behind their own walls. And because there's very little economic integration, the potential for war is a lot higher. And so that's one of the key challenges that should be on the top of all our minds.
많은 사람들이 탈세계화, 세계화의 종언, 그 다음에 세계화의 종말,
예.
뭐 이런 말을 하는데 자기는 그건 동의할 수 없다. 앞으로의 세계화에서는 블록화가 진행이 되고 장벽이 높아지고 갈등이 심해지더라도 그 부분에 이 물건을 팔고 사고 그 다음에 그 한도 내에서 하는데 왕성한 교류가 이루어질 가능성 그 부분에 대해서는 얘기를 합니다.
여전히 블록화하면서도 그것도 세계화일 것이다.
네.
저에게는 계속 학교로 등교해야 되는 졸업이라는 의미처럼 말도 안 된다고 생각은 드는데 다만 과거에 우리가 이룩했던 즐기던 세계가 평평한 그 세계화는 끝난 것 같다는 얘기죠.
그렇죠.
자 그렇다면 만약 그 상상하는 그런 새로운 세계화 내지는 다각화, 다극화가 이루어질 경우에 누가 제일 유리하거나 이런 변화의 승리자가 누구였구나라는 걸 우리는 나중에 깨닫게 될까요?
In the vertical world, I don't believe that we can continue existing in a global environment with one superpower. That I believe is ending. A lot of people have said China will trump America as the world's superpower. I definitely can see China reaching a certain level in the world, but we are ending that design where one nation ruled the world or one nation had control over the world. So we're entering a more fragmented world where different nations will have their own spheres of influence. So in that setup, you have all kinds of winners. You have US, China, European Union, India. I mentioned, and I dedicate an entire chapter in my book to South Korea. I dedicate an entire chapter in my book to Japan. I dedicate an entire chapter in my book to the Arab world, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, Israel. There's not just one winner. It's not that China is going to succeed and everyone else is not. What technology is enabling countries to do is to erect these walls and say, hey, we don't want to do business with you, or we don't want to join you. Look at Eastern Europe. What's happening in Lithuania, where you have the Lithuanian government telling its citizens, throw away Chinese smartphones. Lithuania is not a large economy. It relies on trade with bigger powers. And yet, when it comes to technology, Lithuania is saying, don't use Chinese technology. It's coming preloaded with censorship software. So this is an example of there is no clear winner as in one nation. There's going to be multiple winners. Now, the losers, however, are going to be those countries and those companies. And I would say the emphasis should be on companies that don't adapt, that keep on trying to operate in the old design of globalization, or keep on trying to ignore the barriers that are emerging around labor, around supply chains, around the movement of resources, or think they won't be affected. So one example that I talk about in the book is that Quad, which is that defense bloc with the US, Australia, India, and Japan. Quad is building these supply chains. They call them China-free supply chains for rare earth metals. So these are the metals and minerals in all the high-tech goods. And the question that I pose in the book is that what happens tomorrow if Quad tells its companies, right? America is a member of Quad. America tells its companies, use rare earth metals from Quad. Don't use rare earth metals from China or Russia. Use it from Quad. What happens to Apple? What happens to Google? And what happens if China tells Apple, if you use rare earth metals from Quad, you can't sell into the Chinese market? So now companies are really going to have to be masters of the vertical world to figure out how to maintain their profitability, how to continue to grow, or they're going to end up like Huawei. Right? Huawei is locked out of markets. TikTok is locked out of markets.
작은 블록의 리더들은 더 좋아질 수도 있을까요?
그렇죠.
모르겠습니다.
자기 텃밭을 지키면서 나름대로 규모가 크진 않지만 옛날에 세계화 시대에 지향했던 그런 정도의 규모 경제는 아니지만 그렇다는 겁니다. 프라캐시, 마지막으로 사실 그 한국의 시청자들과 처음으로 얘기하시는 거니까 그 이 질문을 빼놓을 수 없을 것 같습니다. 사실 한국이 이 세계화 시대에 국내에서는 거기에 대한 반발도 심하고 내지는 저항도 컸습니다만은 세계화의 수혜국이었습니다. FTA를 앞장서서 한다든지 그런 한국이 이렇게 어떤 수직적으로 바뀌는 세계 속에서 한국의 설 자리, 한국의 위상, 한국의 위치는 어떻게 될까요?
Let's not mince words here. It's going to be a challenging era. But one of the great advantages, I would say, is that countries can build a new kind of independence for themselves. Countries can build a new kind of voice for themselves. That countries don't have to remain subservient to a specific design or a specific way of doing things, countries can rise up and say, hey, this is our way of doing things. This is how we want to take our country forward. There are great challenges. There is going to be great friction. The world is fragmenting. These are not rosy words, but there is the other side of the coin, which is that there is an opportunity for countries to rethink their place in the world like never before. And one of the countries is South Korea. What South Korea is doing with semiconductors, as I mentioned before, is an example of South Korea and the South Korean government taking a lead and saying, this is where we're going to build our sovereignty. This is where we're going to build our independence. This is the new economic design that we're going to have. And it's not going to be an economic design where we are reliant on anyone else, but when the world comes to us and when the world is reliant on us. South Korea has also been looking at building its own operating system to replace the American operating systems. And that's another example of South Korea building this tech sovereignty or this new kind of independence in the world. But another area that probably doesn't go on the radar is how South Korea is making these massive moves with the metaverse. And South Korea really is leading, one of the leaders when it comes to building a metaverse or multiple metaverses. And that will become a new field of the vertical world. But the question that South Korea has to ask itself is that before, countries like South Korea, Japan, they were poster childs for globalization. And they succeeded because of globalization. We've all grown up with South Korean brands, and that's only because of globalization. That was a possibility. But now, if South Korea is saying, well, we want to now go from building cars or building appliances to now building semiconductors on a different level, how do we do that at a time when Japan wants to do the same thing, India wants to do the same thing, EU wants to do the same thing, Saudi Arabia has started building its own chips, America wants to do the same thing. So again, the fragmentation, so the push for independence, a new kind of independence, but at the same time, a fragmentation. And so this is why I mention in the conclusion of my book that there's a bit of a paradox to the vertical world. That on one hand, globalization is undergoing a massive change, a massive transformation. Countries are walking away from one another. The supply chains are breaking. Walls and barriers are being erected. But at the same time, a new kind of globalization is taking place where countries are integrating with like-minded nations. Countries are building these strategic alliances. So it's a paradox that is a bit of a mystery, but we're just seeing starting.
예전에는 물건만 좋으면 팔라먹기 나쁘지 않았는데 이제는 친분 관계조차 있어야 된다라는 거니까 피곤하죠. 그래서 온 세상이 피곤해지는 가운데 일부 기회를 찾는 나라와 개인은 있을 것이다.
충분히. 주목받는 신의 스타죠. 신의 전문가를 캐나다 신의 전문가를 불러다가
예.
과연 지금 현재 우리가 갈등하고 그다음 고민하고 뭐 가슴을 부심한다 그러죠. 가슴을 태우면서 지켜보고 있는 현상.
예.
이 현상에 대한 그 일단의 정리를 한번 시도를 해봤습니다.
그럴게요. 전반적으로는 뭐 어려워지는 산업들이 많은 것 같은데 우리나라에서는
예.
그러다 보면 또 새로운 기회가 생기는 거 아니겠습니까?
그렇죠. 프라캐시 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네.
다음에 또 이 좀 더 섹션 책을 발표하면 다시 한번 인터뷰를 요청하겠습니다.
고맙습니다.
예.
네.
우리의
그래도 재미있는 인터뷰였고요.
그렇죠.
가끔씩은 인터뷰를 할 때마다 모호한 대답을 들을 때도 있는데 저는 그것을 여기에 대해서는 전문가들조차 뚜렷한 답은 갖고 있지
당연하죠.
않구나. 네, 그래서 저는 인터뷰를 통해서 뭔가를 새롭게 알아가는 것도 중요하지만 이 부분이 인류에게 있어서는 미지의 영역이구나라고 하는 것을 구별하는 것만도 굉장히 중요한 것이고, 그래서 아는 것을 안다고 하고 모르는 것을 모른다고 하는 게 그게 바로 아는 것이다.
그렇죠.
라는 어디에 나오는 얘기였던 것 같은데
기억이 안 나는데 이제 들은 것 같기도 하고
네.
우리 어머니가 말씀해 주셨나?
예.
이 대목에서 이 의사진행 발언을 하나 우리
예.
3프로 구독자분들께 해야 될 것 같습니다. 가끔 어떤 인터뷰를 통해서 3프로나 아니면 중앙일보, 글로벌머니가 어떤 의견을 강조하고 싶다라는 인상을 줄 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 인터뷰. 그러나 분명히 인터뷰는 그들이 어떻게 생각하고 있는지를 일단 들어보자는 게 기본 원칙입니다.
예.
예, 그 점을 좀 다시 한번 늘 기억해 주셨으면 감사합니다.
예, 저희 뭐 시청자들은 괜찮아. 너희들이 알아서 하면 우리는 알아서 들을게.
그렇죠.
그 정도
사실은,
분별력은 있어.
아, 그렇죠. 가끔 저희도 또
모여계십니다,
근데 가끔
그런
댓글에 가슴에 상처받는 댓글이 있습니다.
네, 저희가 안티프라민 발라드리겠습니다. 예, 댓글 상처에는 안티프라민. 자, 오늘은 여기서 마무리하고요. 저희는 다음 주에 또 인터뷰 재밌는 거 갖고 올 게 확실하죠?
예, 다음에는 사실 우리 사실 글로벌머니토크에서 한번 인터뷰를 했던 제임스 리카즈가 본 탈달러화, 달러화의 위상이 축소되고 있는가, 기축통화로서 달러가 달러가 기축통화의 지위를 잃어가고 있는 건 아닌가라는 그 미국 내에서 제가 부자 몸조심 같아요. 미국 내에서 논란이 비등합니다. 그 부분에 대해서 이번에 우크라이나 사태 때문에 그 인도나 중국이 러시아산 원유를 수입을 하면서 자국 통화로 결제를 해버리지 않습니까? 이것을 탈달러화의 시장 내지는 중요한 모멘텀으로 보고 긴장하는 목소리가 월가 주변에서 커지고 있습니다. 그래서 원조 탈달러화 가능성을 경고한 제임스 리카즈에게 좀 진단을 좀 의뢰해 볼 생각입니다.
달러의 시대는 끝났는가?
예.
해묵은 주제이기도 하고 늘 나오는 주제이기도 하고.
그러나 지금 굉장히 비등합니다.
네.
뜨겁습니다. 무슨 팔팔 끓는 팥죽과 같은 그런 상황.
그래서 달러의 위기 이야기가 나올 때마다 미국인들 중에 일부가 하는 얘기는 달러가 불안할 때는 당신들 나라의 화폐를 먼저 걱정해라.
그렇긴 해요.
그렇죠. 달러가 불안하면 어디서 깨지겠습니까?
그렇죠.
이머징이 먼저 깨지지.
네,
그래서 달러가 불안하다 싶을 때는 당신들의 화폐를 먼저 걱정해야 되긴 하는데 그래도 달러의 미래를 궁금해할 수밖에 없는 상황이죠.
예.
네, 그래서 그 얘기를 또 재미있게 듣는다는. 자, 저희는 다음 시간에 또 재미있는 인터뷰거리 갖고 돌아오겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.